Hello and welcome. Let us discuss this question that came in the year 2014 and is related to the topic environmental legislation. The question is, the most important strategy for the conservation of biodiversity together with traditional human life is the establishment of biosphere reserves, botanical gardens, national parks or wildlife sanctuaries. Let us see these areas one by one. As far as biosphere reserves are concerned, they are international designation by UNESCO, that is United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. So they designate biosphere reserves. Now, conservation of biodiversity together with traditional human life is the basic aspect of biosphere reserve. Also, as far as India is concerned, there are 18 biosphere reserves in India, and the latest to be added is Panna Biosphere Reserve in Madhya Pradesh. So if we see biosphere reserves, then biosphere reserves are basically divided into three areas: core area, buffer area and transition zone. Now the basic aspect of biosphere reserve is to conserve environment as a whole. Now in core areas, basically national park or wildlife sanctuary, various activities are prohibited. Many activities are prohibited. So core areas are there for proper conservation of wildlife and natural resources. Whereas in buffer areas, in core areas also no human activities are allowed, like grazing, agriculture. These are not allowed in national parks. As far as buffer zone is concerned, so in buffer areas, these activities, the forest rights of forest dwelling communities are reserved in buffer zone. So here various human activities like grazing etc. are allowed in buffer zone. This area, buffer area, also helps in reduction of man-animal conflict. And the transition area is basically helps in reduction of impact of urbanization and industrialization, and in a way they protect the environment as a whole. So these are the basic properties of biosphere reserves. If we see botanical gardens, then they are basically used for research and educational purposes. Ferns, conifers, flowering plants, these are conserved in botanical gardens. As far as Botanical Survey of India is concerned, then this is headquartered in Kolkata. So botanical gardens are helpful for ex situ conservation. Whereas protected areas like national parks and sanctuaries are used for in situ conservation. This is out of sight conservation, away from the native place. Whereas as far as national parks and sanctuaries are concerned, so their in situ conservation is done. Now if we see national parks, then they are habitat specific. That is, along with the species, the overall habitat is protected in national parks. The boundaries are fixed and defined. Boundaries are fixed and defined, and no human activities are allowed in this area. That is, habitat rights or cultivation is not allowed in national parks, and more restrictions as compared to wildlife sanctuaries are there. So here, more prohibition, less permission. In national park, more prohibition, less permission. As far as India is concerned, there are more than 100 national parks in India, 100 plus national parks in India. That accounts to around 1.11% of the, or 1.11 to 1.33% of the country's geographical area. Now, as far as the designation of national parks are concerned, then both central and state government can designate any area as national park. And once an area is designated as national park, it cannot be downgraded to be a wildlife sanctuary. So once it has been designated as national park, so it remains national park. Also, if we want to change the boundary of national park, then separate legislation in state government has to be passed as far as changing the boundary of national parks is concerned. Separate state legislation. If we see wildlife sanctuary, then wildlife sanctuaries are species specific. For example, Ranthambore Tiger Sanctuary. So that is species specific for tiger. They are formed under Wildlife Protection Act 1972. Also, national parks are also formed under Wildlife Protection Act 1972. And the declaration is done by state government. Also, central government also signifies any area. Both central government and state government can designate any area as wildlife sanctuary. If central government feels that any wildlife requires specific attention for their conservation, then they can designate an area where the population of that specific species are very large. They can designate that area as wildlife sanctuary. As far as state governments are concerned, then they can also designate on similar manner any area as wildlife sanctuary. Now, as far as the changing the boundary of wildlife sanctuaries are concerned, then there is a requirement of permission from National Board for Wildlife. Permit is required from National Board for Wildlife, which is also mentioned in Wildlife Protection Act 1972. And once an area is designated, this area can be upgraded to national park. Wildlife sanctuary can be upgraded to national park, but national park cannot be downgraded as wildlife sanctuary. Here, more permission is there, less prohibition and more permission, whereas in national park, more prohibition, less permission. So some of the activities like grazing, collecting minor forest producers are accorded in wildlife sanctuaries. So if we see this question, that the most important strategy for the conservation of biodiversity together with traditional human life is basically the aspect of biosphere reserve. So A is our correct answer. Thank you.